Joshua Schmidt, Joshua Schmidt, and I am the middle school math teacher in McCook Central, South Dakota.
And how long have you been a math teacher here?
This is my 5th year, and I've taught 7th and 8th grade all 5 years, and then this is my 2nd year of 6th grade math.
Okay. Josh, from your perspective, what makes the implementation at your school significantly different from what happens in industrial age or traditional school classrooms?
I have incredible autonomy in my classroom that in a lot of ways I was allowed to fail. And I think in a lot of schools that when you try something new, that there's usually someone who is pretty apprehensive about it. But Brad, my principal, has been very much on board with allowing me to try new things. And I wouldn't have been able to get where I am today without being allowed to try and fail sometimes.
Differentiate it a bit more in terms of what's happening in that math classroom versus what would be happening in a traditional math classroom down the hall.
My students are at a fully independent pace so that they can move as fast or as slow as they need to on a material. Everything we cover is technological. Everything's on a computer or a PDF document or Google Drive, something like that. And I don't do any standard lecture at all in front of my classes. So the students are always going to be either working independently or small groups, which is very different than a traditional environment.
Why is that difference important to you as a teacher?
I feel like the more that I talk in front of a classroom, the less that my students learn. I feel like there is a level of cognitive difficulty with every assignment, and the more that I do, the less my students have to do. And so my goal is to give them as much of that cognitive difficulty on a day-to-day basis as possible. So the less that I stand up in front of the class, the less that they can kind of just watch. And I want them to do as much as humanly possible.
So as you reflect on this approach that you're using to teaching at this point in time, what would you identify as the key starting point for you, or how did you ramp into it?
For me, my starting point was in my 2nd year. I decided to flip my math classroom, which meant that instead of a lecture environment, I started to take videos to replace lecture, and that students would be watching the videos at home and then doing the homework in class, which a lot of math teachers have started doing. What I learned, though, from that is that I valued classroom work time a lot more than I valued lecture time, and it's continued to evolve as we've gone.
What was the biggest challenge with making this approach work for you as a teacher?
The biggest challenge still is I'm on my own 100% of the time, which means that every bit of curriculum that I make is 100% me. And while that's really nice that I don't necessarily have to argue or develop or compete with somebody, I also don't have anyone to rely on at the same time. So for me, if I have a bad assignment, it's 100% my fault. And if I have a bad video or there's some type of error on the website, that's me who's done that. And so that has created challenges inside of structuring and classroom management and other things where it's just I'm kind of on my own. Which has made me try to branch out as much as humanly possible to find other people who are in the same boat as I am.
What would you describe as the response or the reaction of most of the learners in your classroom to this approach?
I haven't had a lot of issues with learners. I have the same complaints that every other math teacher has. There's too much work, the kids have to think too hard and it takes too long. It's the same complaints that anyone else gets. My benefits, though, I think really outweigh those challenges, that my students now are as close to their appropriate level as humanly possible every day. And rather than have a day where a kid's either way below the material presented or way above, it feels like every day they're at least closer to where they should be.
How has this approach impacted your relationship with students, with the learners in your classroom?
It's been a huge benefit. In the past, when I would do a lecture environment, I would talk for 30 to 35 minutes, and then we would work for 10 to 15 minutes each day. Now, it's 45 minutes of true work time every single day. So everything that I do is in small groups or independent with my students, and it means that rather than talking to them as a group, I get many more opportunities to work with each kid individually.
How has this approach impacted your role as a teacher?
I feel like I don't teach as much as I facilitate now. That in a lot of ways I'm an overqualified proctor. That the less that I have to do every day, the more that the kid does. And I feel like if I can stand back and watch, that's better than me being there kind of helicoptering over that kid. I want them to learn independent of me as much as possible. I'm still there as a safety net, but in a lot of ways, I don't want to be needed by the kid as much as I was before.
Because your classroom is considerably different than many of the other classrooms now at McCook, how has it affected your relationship with other teachers, or how do they perceive your efforts?
One of the things that I'm afraid of is that people see the end result of my classroom and not the steps along the way. And in trying to convince other teachers that this is manageable and doable, they see what my classroom looks like now, and it feels like it's a long ways away. And I try to convince them that, you know, I started with a very small step, and each year I only add bits and pieces to my classroom. And so for a teacher who's looking to do something like this, changing one unit or one project or even one lesson is a giant step in the right direction. You don't have to get all the way that I have in order to be successful.
What evidence would you offer that the approach you're using is impacting learners and learning positively?
I feel like it's difficult in regards to test scores and things like that in order to be fully accurate when it comes to where kids are. But I know for a fact that I'm covering substantially more material each year than I ever have before. The biggest resource that I've gained is time. That it used to take me 35 minutes to lecture, and then the kids would need a full day to do their assignments. I take that 35 minutes away, and at worst I replace it with a 10-minute video. And there is 25 to 30 minutes of extra time that I gain, sometimes daily. And so we have covered substantially more material this year. So at the very least, I know that my students have been forced to think at a higher difficulty level and cover more material. And I hope, you know, crossing my fingers, that there will be benefits in test scores. But a lot of times it takes years to really discover that impact.
So based on your experience, what is some advice you would offer teachers who are considering this kind of an approach? What would you say to them to nudge them forward?
I would say if you try it, you'll convince yourself. I don't have to convince anyone. If I can get them to use one unit or one project in a customized approach, they'll never go back. And that's what happened to me, that as soon as I did flipped classroom for a week, I never wanted to go back to a pure lecture environment. The benefits were massive, even right away. And every day that I work now, I'm really happy that I made this change, because the benefits that I see on a daily basis are just head and shoulders above anything that I had before.
And what about an anecdote or an experience from the last couple of years that would reflect how this approach has been meaningful or impactful for you or students?
One of my proudest moments is I had a freshman student come to us who had not taken algebra. She was in a standard system, and then she jumped into my freshman algebra course, and she was able to get through that course and then 3 extra years of math, and is now taking calculus as a junior in high school. That type of system doesn't work for every kid, but she would have failed in a standard classroom. And now she's taking 2 AP classes as a junior. She's looking to take 2 or 3 classes as a senior. And that kid is, you know, best off by being able to go at her own speed. So basically all I had to do was give her the resources and get out of the way.
You're making me think of another question, Josh, in terms of what about struggling learners in terms of your classroom? How is this different than the kinds of struggles that they have in a traditional classroom?
I think a lot of times when people look at a customized approach, they look at the top level kids. That it definitely is beneficial to them to get out of their way and let them move at their own speed. But one of the best things for my low level learners is that those top kids aren't with them anymore. They don't have to compete with the best kid in the class on an assignment. That they can do it at their speed and at their level. And I can work with them one-on-one every day to truly understand that material. Before, or in a lecture-based environment, if a kid fails a quiz or a test and you're out of time, they just fail it and you move on. For me, my kids never move on until they've reached an appropriate score on an assignment, which means that every assignment for me gets turned in eventually. Every quiz gets passed, every test gets passed, and that would not exist in a lecture environment.
Working at their own pace does assume that they're going to take maybe more responsibility for their learning than they did before in a traditional classroom. How has that worked, or how have you encouraged them to take more responsibility?
I think that with the classroom structure itself, it forces the kid to take more responsibility. There's not a lot of handicapping that I can do with a kid, that when they walk into my classroom every day, they have to tell me what they're working on. They have to have their grade sheet filled out. And I can't really babysit them at all. Just having the structure by itself forces kids to be more mature. And I think that's probably been one of the largest benefits, that even if I covered the exact same material that I covered before, the level of responsibility that my kids gain makes it all worth it.
What's next for you and for your work in terms of embracing this approach even more?
This year I've been transferring my 8th grade curriculum to as close to 100% project-based as possible. My goal would be next year for 6th and 7th grade to get them closer to that project-based environment as well. I still think that I'm going to use mostly traditional quizzes and tests, but my goal now is to just increase the number of resources, give students more meaningful choices, and then make sure everything is applicable to the real world.
You're beginning to now have these kids transition into high school math. Talk about that transition for them.
We have a traditional high school classroom. So when they go there, they're no longer at independent pacing the way they are now. So for some kids, we have to put them on an alternative track because they got far enough ahead in middle school. But for most kids, they end up back in a traditional environment. And at some point, it's a tough transition. But they also come back and say that, well, class was way tougher last year because they were always pushed at their own pace. Every day was challenging for them, and sometimes now they end up in an easier environment. But I also have a lot fewer issues from that end. You know, I don't have kids coming back to me missing 10 or 12 assignments because they're used to doing something every single day.
It's my understanding that McCook Central is working at making this also be a part of the high school math program. Talk about where that is in transition.
Our high school classroom right now is on a flipped model, 1-to-1. So where I had started my classroom was with one video for one lesson every day. And now Doug, our high school math teacher, is in the process of transitioning from that flipped environment to an independent pacing. But like I've talked with you before, that every classroom is going to look drastically different in a customized approach. And so he's trying to find out what his end result would look like compared to mine.
You're in a relatively small school district, and it's having a huge impact from your perspective, from my perspective. So if I'm in a small school district, your evidence that this can happen speaks directly to these teachers in small school districts who may be the only math teacher, the only science teacher.
I know that in a small district, it feels like you're alone, but at the same time, if you're in a small district, you are the entire change. When I decided to change my classroom, I changed the entire middle school math curriculum in a year. That I know that it's difficult, you know, feeling like you're on an island, but you also are the only person who has to change. You don't have to fight against a whole group of people. If you believe that this is the best way to go, you're the only person who has to make that transition. And for me especially, it's challenging because I wish that I had more resources, but at the same time, I was the one that got to make my mark on my classroom.
You were one of the attendees and did some sharing at one of the first meetings of the South Dakota cohort. What did you gain from that interaction? What would you hope others could gain from being a part of the cohort?
I think that one of the things that I learned is that tons of teachers are making the same transition that I am in different pockets. And we all kind of say the same thing, that we wish that we interacted more. And I feel like as long as I can get out and meet as many people as possible, and other teachers can find other schools and other teachers who are working, that type of assistance toward each other makes everyone stronger. My fear is that people look at customized learning as this thing that we're trying to add to education, you know, just like every other thing that we add. But for me, it's a transformative action. That this isn't something that's going to disappear. This isn't, I'm not going to go back to a lecture-based environment. I believe incredibly strongly that this is actually the best way to teach, and that I'm going to do everything I can to convince every teacher that this is beneficial to them.